The raw, bracing smell of the Atlantic still dominated the air over Port Clyde, Maine, a mix of brine, diesel, and wet pine, even after the ferocious nor'easter had finally passed. But Elena, a woman whose hands knew the intimate language of ropes and nets, was already at work. She was known along the coastline as the Iron Skipper, not for her temperament, but for the unwavering resolve with which she piloted her aging lobster boat, the Sea Witch. Her life was as stark and demanding as the granite cliffs of the Maine Coast, defined by the grueling rhythm of the tides and the constant companionship of Zeus, her imposing Belgian Malinois. Zeus was more than a dog, he was her constant shadow, her silent confidant, and the only living soul she truly trusted after the unexpected loss of her brother at sea years ago. The storm had brutally rearranged the shore. Pieces of docks, shredded netting, and broken cedar planks lay scattered everywhere, a muddy, chaotic mess against the cold, gray sand. Elena trudged along the titterline in her heavy-duty boots, assessing the damage to her traps and gear. The ocean, which gave her life, had shown its most unforgiving face. Zeus, however, was unnaturally excited. He was running ahead, but suddenly slammed to a stop, his body taut, his senses fully engaged. He was sniffing a large, slimy pile of sea debris and kelp with absolute focus, a primitive instinct overriding his training. "Zeus, enough. Come on, buddy," Elena called out, her voice rough from the wind and the salt, but the relentless roar of the Atlantic swallowed her words. The dog ignored her, fixated on one specific spot. Intrigued and slightly uneasy, Elena approached, kicking aside chunks of washed-up wood. And then she saw it. It wasn't just a log or a piece of trash. It was a chest, small, immensely heavy, and dark, with metal fittings that the decades of rust had turned a sickening, deep green. It looked like a forgotten relic, something the deep ocean had reluctantly coughed up. Elena knelt, feeling the rough, cold, waterlogged wood under her gloved fingers. The chest was secured by a thick padlock, fused to the metal by decades of corrosion. The sheer force of the nor'easter had unearthed this secret. A shiver ran down her spine. In these tight-knit fishing communities, people were deeply superstitious. Finding an object this old and mysterious was often seen as a sign, an omen of fate. But for Elena, whose faith was placed more in her own strength than in the sea gods, it was an irresistible puzzle. She tried to lift it, but the weight surprised her. It wasn't just the wet wood, there was something dense inside, a weight of history and mystery. Zeus, exhausted from digging but triumphant, sat squarely beside the chest and stared at her with his serious, amber eyes, establishing a silent conversation that clearly asked, "There it is. Now what?" His quiet presence was a command she could not ignore. The decision was instantaneous, charged with a strange, secret thrill. She couldn't leave the chest exposed for the nosy locals to see, nor at the mercy of the next high tide. Using a thick docking rope from her boat, she secured it to the chest and, summoning the brute strength that earned her nickname, she struggled to drag it across the sand to the sheltered space beneath her wooden fishing shack. The exertion left her breathless, but the adrenaline of the intrigue kept her moving. Under the shack's floor, covered by an old, oil-stained canvas tarp, the chest was hidden. That afternoon, with the faint, orange light of the fading Maine sunset filtering through the cracks in her cabin walls, Elena examined her find. She could just make out a small etching on the lid, the initials, AL, interwoven in a floral design, nearly erased by time. This was not a simple shipwreck relic, it was the residue of a life. She felt that by opening this box, she wouldn't just be revealing a 40-year-old secret, she would be pulling back the curtain on a past that the ocean, in its capricious will, had decided she was meant to guard and uncover. The padlock, stuck fast like an old wound, was the last barrier. Elena grabbed her heaviest hammer and a weathered chisel, tools usually reserved for hull repairs. The metallic sound of the first strike echoed sharply in the small cabin, a noise that signaled the end of her quiet life and the true start of the search. She knew she was about to unearth something far deeper than an object. She was about to release a long-held truth, a secret that, thanks to the random fury of the nor'easter and Zeus's persistence, was now her urgent responsibility to reveal. Her breath quickened. The mystery was giving her a vitality that her years of grief had stolen. The sea had delivered not just destruction, but a silent, compelling destiny. The heavy, metallic thunk of the hammer against the old chisel felt strangely loud in the quiet of Elena's cabin. Zeus, alerted by the unusual noise, raised his large head from the patch of rug where he was resting, his eyes fixed on the chest. Elena was working by the dim light of an old kerosene lamp, casting long, nervous shadows that danced with every swing of the tool. The padlock, thick and deeply embedded in the wood by decades of saltwater corrosion, resisted violently. Each strike sent a shower of orange rust and splinters of aged wood across the floor. This wasn't like fixing the sea witch, this was trying to break through a wall of time itself. Elena paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Frustration was creeping in, but beneath it was a stubborn curiosity that she hadn't felt since her brother's passing, a desire to uncover a hidden truth. The chest wasn't just metal and wood, it was an artifact burdened with the weight of 40 years, a silent promise of a secret. She felt an immense responsibility, as if the nor'easter had chosen her specifically to be the one to release this truth. She decided to switch tactics. Instead of attacking the lock directly, she focused the chisel on the old staple securing the lock to the wooden lid. She leveraged the tool deep into the soft, waterlogged wood, pulling with all the strength that had earned her the nickname, the Iron Skipper. The wood around the fitting groaned, a dry, protesting sound that echoed the years of silence. With one final, wrenching pull, the old staple snapped free with a sharp crack. The padlock, still stubbornly attached to the staple, fell heavily onto the wooden floor. Elena held her breath. The moment of truth was here. She slowly and carefully lifted the heavy lid. A blast of musty, damp air, mixed with the sharp scent of old paper and copper, escaped the confines of the box. She peered inside, her heart pounding a quick, uneven rhythm. The contents were surprisingly few, yet each item seemed weighted with significance. The first thing she noticed was a layer of damp, yellowed cloth covering everything. Beneath it, protected in some way from the worst of the water damage, lay a small, leather-bound journal. It was tied shut with a thin, faded red ribbon. Next to it was a small, ornate silver locket, tarnished almost black, and a neatly folded stack of old photographs, secured with a rubber band that had crumbled with age. Finally, tucked into a corner, she saw a piece of thick, heavy paper, completely sealed with a wax stamp that bore the same faint AL monogram she had seen etched on the outside. Elena carefully lifted the journal, the fragile paper feeling like tissue in her hands. The leather was cold and slick, and the inscription on the front was too faded to read clearly. She realized with a sudden, sinking feeling that she was holding the private life of someone she had never known, a life that had been swallowed by the sea decades ago. She decided, in that moment, that the secret was hers alone. The people of Port Clyde were already too curious, their community too small and too prone to gossip. She knew that revealing this find prematurely would not bring peace, but chaos. The sea had given her a treasure, but it was a treasure of secrets, not of gold. Zeus rose, nudged his wet snout against her arm in a gesture of shared mission, and settled back down, becoming the only silent guardian of the 40-year-old mystery. The nor'easter had brought the destruction of winter, but for Elena, it had also delivered an irresistible enigma that finally demanded her full attention, pulling her away from her quiet grief and towards a past that demanded to be understood. The thin, musty air that had escaped the chest lingered in Elena's small cabin, a breath from the past that settled around her like the fog rolling in off the Atlantic. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the kerosene lamp casting her silhouette huge and wavering against the plank walls, while Zeus lay patiently, his chin resting on his paws, watching her every move. The real treasure wasn't the tarnished silver locket or the water-warped photographs, it was the small, leather-bound journal. Its mere presence in her hands, so fragile and cold, felt like a monumental intrusion into a life long since vanished. Elena carefully peeled away the faded red ribbon that held the journal shut. The cover was too damp and worn to read the inscription, but the pages inside, protected to some extent by the thick leather and the overlying cloth, were mostly legible, albeit swollen and crinkled. She opened the book to the first page, her heart still hammering the uneven rhythm started by the opening of the chest. The handwriting was tight and angular, the ink having faded to a sepia tone. The very first entry, scrawled with a mixture of hope and anxiety, provided the critical first clue. June 14, 1983. Port Clyde, me. Today, the sea glass sails without me. I've chosen a different course. The date, 1983, immediately confirmed the 4-decade timeline. Elena was just a child in the early 80s. The name, Sea Glass, also registered. It was the name of a fishing boat owned by the McAvoy family, a prominent clan in the area who had lost a son at sea around that time, though the exact details were blurred by decades of rumor and avoidance. The Sea Glass incident was part of Port Clyde's local tragedy, one of those wounds the town collectively agreed not to poke. But it was the initial scrawled letters at the top of the page that truly sent a chill down her spine, connecting the inside to the outside, the full signature, slightly smudged, but undeniably there, Alastair Lowell. Alastair Lowell. The initials, A.L., on the chest now had a name. Elena felt a dizzying surge of conflicting emotions, triumph for solving the first part of the riddle, and deep unease for disturbing the peace of the dead. She remembered an old tale her father, a fisherman of few words and much wisdom, used to tell: the sea only gives up what it can no longer hold. If it gives you a secret, it expects you to carry it. She flipped through a few pages. The entries started sparse but quickly became filled with the passionate, troubled reflections of a young man caught between two worlds. Alastair, the entries revealed, was the son of a wealthy shipyard owner in Rockland, just up the coast, but he was desperately in love with the hard, demanding life of the fisherman in Port Clyde. He wrote of the beauty of the dawn on the water, the fierce independence of the local captains, and the suffocating pressure from his father to take a respectable job in finance. He wrote with the melancholy idealism of youth, sketching simple drawings of lobster traps and buoy markers in the margins. As she read further into the summer of '83, a second name began to appear with increasing frequency, written with a tenderness that made the ink seem warmer: Celia. Celia was local, a woman who worked at the dockside diner, serving coffee and tough love to the fishermen. Alastair wrote of stolen moments, shared clam chowder at sunset, secret walks along the tide pools near Marshall Point Lighthouse, the feeling of her hand in his. Their romance was a beautiful secret, but also a dangerous one. Alastair's family, the wealthy Lowells, would never approve of a girl from the docks. And Celia's family, old-school Port Clyde to the core, were wary of summer people and city boys. The local conflict was sharp, the old money versus the working hands, the shipyards versus the lobster boats. Their love, Alastair realized, was a betrayal of two distinct worlds. One entry, dated August 3rd, stood out, filled with frantic, nearly illegible script: Celia is terrified. I have to make a decision, a final one. I cannot lose her. Not now. Father will ruin everything if he finds out about the news. This chest is all I have to keep my promises safe. The sea which is the last thing I see before. Elena froze. The sea witch. Her boat. The aging lobster boat that had been in her family for 3 generations. The last thing Alastair saw before what? The entry ended abruptly, smudged and illegible, as if the writer had been interrupted by panic or disaster. This was no general shipwreck, this was a highly personal, localized event tied directly to her own legacy. The realization made her hands clammy. The sea hadn't just given up a secret, it had sent the secret directly to the sea witch's owner. Elena looked down at Zeus, who lifted his head slightly, his serious amber eyes meeting hers, a silent exchange that reinforced the gravity of the find. She felt a profound connection to Alastair Lowell, a young man who died carrying a heavy secret. The chest contained the record of a desperate love and a life-altering choice, and now, Elena held the weight of resolving it. She pushed the thought of the familiar face in the photographs out of her mind for a moment, focusing on the immediate crisis described in the journal. News. What news was so terrifying that it forced Alastair to make a final decision and entrust his deepest secrets to a locked box and the unpredictable sea? She knew, with the cold certainty of a fisherman who reads the clouds, that this news was the key to the entire mystery, and the reason for the chest's 40-year imprisonment beneath the waves. The journal provided the heart of the story, but the photographs and the sealed letter held the final, crucial pieces of the puzzle. The quiet of her cabin was now humming with the restless, untold truth of 1983. The kerosene lamp flickered, its weak light struggling against the oppressive shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of Elena's small cabin, each shadow a silent witness to the unearthed 40-year-old drama. Zeus, his breathing slow and measured, remained by her side, an anchor in the storm of memory she was willfully diving into. Elena returned to the fragile pages of Alastair Lowell's journal, her fingers careful not to tear the moisture-warped paper. The entries she now focused on spanned the intense, fleeting summer of 1983, detailing the rapid and desperate growth of a love that was doomed from its first stolen kiss. Alastair wrote with the effusive melancholy of a young man trapped between duty and desire. He vividly described the suffocating pressure from his father, the formidable Robert Lowell, owner of the prestigious Rockland shipyards. Robert envisioned a future for his son marked by Ivy League degrees and a respectable career in Boston finance, a path Alastair found utterly sterile. The journal was filled with resentment directed at the Rockland elite, and their rigid expectations, contrasted sharply with a profound, almost spiritual longing for the harsh, honest simplicity of Port Clyde's fishing life. I feel more like a man scraping barnacles off the sea witch than a Lowell preparing for Wall Street, one entry confessed, a line that resonated deeply with Elena, who saw her own defiance of life's easy path reflected in his words. He wrote about the inherent dignity of the fishermen, their hands permanently stained by diesel and brine, a mark of genuine labor Alastair craved. But the core of this section was Celia. She wasn't just a girl, she was the embodiment of the life Alastair yearned for. Celia worked at the dockside diner, serving steaming cups of coffee and tough, unsentimental advice to the fishermen as they came in from the cold, early morning hauls. Alastair's descriptions of her were tender, filled with exquisite detail, the way the morning light caught the gold dust in her brown hair, the quick, sharp wit she used to ward off unwanted advances, and the unexpected softness in her eyes when she looked at him. Their romance was a desperate sequence of stolen moments, shared clam chowder on the back steps of the diner after closing, secret walks along the tide pools near the historic Marshall Point Lighthouse, and the illicit feeling of her hand finding his beneath a shared blanket on cold, late-night dock benches. Their love was a secret not merely because of modesty, but because it was an act of profound betrayal against two entrenched worlds. Alastair's wealthy Lowell family viewed any girl from the Port Clyde docks as nothing more than a local distraction, unsuitable for their lineage and future. Meanwhile, Celia's family, fiercely proud and bound by generations of old-school Port Clyde tradition, were deeply wary of summer people and city boys, particularly one with the powerful, suspect name of Lowell. Alastair wrote of the crippling fear that their love, if discovered, would be crushed by the social and financial chasm between them. "We live in a space no bigger than the gap between two docks, and the tide is always threatening to pull us under," he wrote on July 21, articulating the sharp local conflict between old money and working hands, shipyards and lobster boats. As the weeks bled into August, the tone of the entries shifted dramatically from romantic yearning to sheer, cold panic. The script became frantic, the ink smeared by what Elena assumed were tears or seawater, or perhaps both. The external pressures had intensified, likely due to Alastair's repeated refusal to leave Port Clyde for his scheduled internship in Boston. His father, Robert, had begun making unannounced visits to the town, his presence a dark cloud over the harbor. Then came the entry Elena had previously noted, dated August 3, scribbled in a near-illegible scrawl that suggested the writer was fleeing or in deep distress. "Celia is terrified. I have to make a decision, a final one. I cannot lose her. Not now. Father will ruin everything if he finds out about the news. This chest is all I have to keep my promises safe. The sea which is the last thing I see before." Elena traced the smeared, abrupt ending with her fingertip. News. That single, loaded word. It was the absolute pivot point of Alastair's life and the 40-year secret. What news could be so catastrophic that it warranted abandoning one's entire future and entrusting one's life's deepest secrets to an old box and the unpredictable sea? The urgency in the final sentences felt like a punch to Elena's gut. The connection to the sea which, her family's boat, was no longer a coincidence, it was a desperate, final farewell. Alastair was clearly preparing for an act of finality, an escape or a disappearance, and his use of her boat's name meant he was likely on the water, seeing it as a familiar landmark before what? The illegible ending was maddening, a permanent hole in the story. The news felt ominously obvious, given the historical context of their forbidden romance and the sheer desperation. Celia must have been pregnant. A pregnancy would confirm the forbidden relationship, guaranteeing Alastair's complete disinheritance and crushing Celia's reputation in the small, judgmental community of Port Clyde. It was the ultimate betrayal of both the Lowell name and the local family honor. This potential news turned the box from a record of lost love into a desperate act of preservation, ensuring his promises and potentially his child's future were protected from his father's destructive rage. Elena felt a profound, almost familial ache for the young couple. Her initial detached curiosity had vanished, replaced by a fierce sense of responsibility. The sea hadn't just given her a secret, it had tasked her with a child's forgotten legacy, perhaps even a half-sibling to someone in Port Clyde. She had to find out what happened next. She instinctively knew that the answer lay not in the waterlogged journal, which was cut short, but in the other physical remnants, the small silver locket and, most importantly, the stack of old photographs. The journal had revealed the heart of the story, now, the photographs would reveal the living, breathing consequence of that fatal summer. The raw, emotional weight of Alastair's last journal entry still clung to Elena, a cold, persistent pressure in the small of her back. The frantic mention of Celia, the impending news, and the chilling connection to the sea which had transformed the antique chest from a curiosity into a desperate family quest. She carefully set the fragile, swollen journal aside and turned her attention to the small stack of old, water-warped photographs. They were secured by the brittle remains of a rubber band, which crumbled entirely when she touched it, releasing the memories held captive for 4 decades. The images were faded and stained by the sea, the colors muted into sepia and pale green where the water had seeped in. The first few were unremarkable snapshots of life in Port Clyde in the early 80s, a blurry shot of a lobster boat pulling up traps, likely the sea glass, and a wide, scenic view of the Marshall Point Lighthouse, the very landmark Alastair mentioned as a meeting spot. Elena examined them methodically, looking for faces. She was looking for Alastair and, more urgently, for Celia. The fifth photograph was different. It was a close-up, clearly taken by Alastair himself. The image was of a young woman laughing, her face framed by thick, dark hair that caught the sunlight in an unruly mess. Her eyes, light and expressive, were focused just off camera, clearly looking at the photographer, Alastair. Her laughter seemed to jump off the faded paper. This had to be Celia. She had the sharp, resilient look of someone who worked hard, a dockside girl with a natural toughness that belied her youthful beauty. Elena felt an immediate kinship with the woman, recognizing the fierce independence that defined the women of Port Clyde. She studied the next photograph, taken perhaps moments later. It showed Celia, her hair now damp with seawater, standing by the stern of a small vessel. She was holding a large, freshly caught codfish with a proud, almost defiant smile. The focus was on her, but the boat's name, painted in fading letters on the stern, was visible, the Sea Witch. Elena gasped, a sharp, cold sound in the quiet cabin. The boat in the picture was undeniably hers. The Sea Witch, the aging lobster boat that had been in her family for 3 generations. The vessel was older in the photograph, less weathered by the specific scrapes and repairs that marked its current hull, but the unique shape of the stern and the faded signature font of the name were unmistakable. This confirmed the journal entry: Alastair and Celia had a direct, physical connection to her family's boat. But why? The Sea Witch had belonged to Elena's father back in 1983. Was her father, a man of few words and much wisdom, who always kept his past guarded, involved in this doomed romance and disappearance? The question struck Elena with the force of a tidal wave, complicating the mystery far beyond an ancient shipwreck. The secret was no longer just Alastair's, it was woven into the very fabric of her own family's history. Driven by a mounting sense of urgency and dread, Elena shuffled the remaining photographs. The last one made her freeze completely, the cold paper sticking to her damp palm. It was a picture of 2 men on a dock, clearly posing. One was Alastair Lowell, recognizable by his angular features and his anxious smile. The other man was older, perhaps in his mid-40s, with a fisherman's weathered face, thick gray-flecked beard, and kind, shadowed eyes. He was standing next to Alastair, his arm around the young man's shoulder in a gesture of paternal pride or camaraderie. He wore an old, thick wool sweater that Elena recognized instantly. The older man was her father. The image swam before her eyes. It was her father, young and healthy, but clearly him. The revelation was a gut punch that stole her breath. Her father, the quiet, stoic man who had taught her everything she knew about the sea, who had died believing he had carried all his secrets to the grave, was not just aware of Alastair Lowell, he was with him, seemingly close. This photo, taken just before the August 3rd entry, the entry that ended in disaster, suggested a direct, critical involvement. A flood of memories rushed in, coloring her grief with sharp, new suspicion. Her father had always avoided talking about the summer of 1983, dismissing any questions about the sea glass incident or the disappearance of young men at sea with curt finality. Was he helping Alastair, the wealthy shipowner's son, run away with a local girl? Or, far worse, was he complicit in whatever final, desperate act Alastair performed? The secret was now no longer a historical curiosity, it was a deeply personal, terrifying family trauma that the sea had literally thrown onto her doorstep. She needed an answer, not from the silent, waterlogged pages, but from the living, breathing, secretive pulse of Port Clyde. She had to find out who Celia was, where she went, and what her father's role was in the secret news that drove a young man to a final, desperate decision. Elena carefully placed the photographs back in the box, sealing the chest back under the tarp. The quiet of the cabin now felt hostile, filled with the ghostly presence of the past. The time for private reflection was over. It was time to venture out to the docks and confront the old men and women who had watched Port Clyde's secrets ferment for 40 years, even if it meant stirring up a long-dormant storm in her tight-lipped community. Her first target, the McAvoy family, who owned the Sea Glass and whose son was lost around the same time. The trail of the lost love began at the docks. The next morning, the adrenaline of the discovery was replaced by a cold, leaden determination. Elena left the sea which tied to its mooring, the boat now feeling less like a source of income and more like a ghostly accomplice in a decades-old crime. She left Zeus guarding the shack, his low growl a promise that the secret chest remained untouched. Stepping onto the main wharf of Port Clyde felt different today. The familiar smell of diesel and bait, usually comforting, now carried a faint, unsettling scent of unspoken history. She was no longer just Elena, the iron skipper, she was the bearer of a dangerous, unwelcome question. Port Clyde, like many small Maine fishing towns, thrived on a carefully curated silence. The community's unwritten rules were enforced not by police, but by the powerful social sanctions of gossip, slander, and shunning. People here learned early that some stories were collectively buried, especially those involving the sea and the old conflict between the working hands on the lobster boats and the old money from the Rockland shipyards. Elena's target was the dockside diner, the heart of the community's morning ritual, and specifically Old Man Finnegan. Finnegan, who sat at the same booth every morning, was a repository of Port Clyde's hidden histories, having worked the lobster ground since the 1960s. His eyes, perpetually squinted from the sun and sea, missed nothing. She slid into the booth across from him, the plastic seat squeaking a protest that drew the attention of 3 other grizzled captains at the counter. Finnegan looked up from his third cup of coffee, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. "Morning, Elena. You're off the water early." "Too much damage from the nor'easter?" he rasped, his voice sounding like dry rope. Elena ignored the small talk, placing the water-stained photograph of her father and Alastair Lowell directly on the sticky tabletop between their mugs. The fragile paper lay there, a shocking, silent accusation. "I need you to tell me about this, Finnegan." August 1983. "Who is this young man, and what was he doing with my father?" Her voice was low, but steel-edged, cutting through the usual morning banter. Finnegan's reaction was immediate and profound. His hand, reaching for his coffee, froze midair. The color drained from his weathered face, leaving a pale, unhealthy pallor beneath the perpetual tan. His squinted eyes widened, darting nervously between Elena, the photograph, and the other men at the counter. The diner, minutes before a hive of banter and camaraderie, fell into an agonizing silence. The only sound was the clatter of a fork dropped by the waitress behind the counter. "Put that away, girl," Finnegan whispered, his voice trembling, not with anger, but with fear. He tried to cover the photograph with a huge, trembling hand, but Elena was quicker, pulling it back. His name was Alastair Lowell. He disappeared with the Sea Glass incident. My father was the last man to be photographed with him, Finnegan. I know what you all covered up. The McAvoy kid wasn't the only one lost. Elena leaned in, pushing the boundary of the community's strict code of silence. The fear in Finnegan's eyes was quickly replaced by a cold, obstinate hardness, the practiced defensiveness of a man protecting decades of shared guilt. "Some things the sea takes, Elena. You learn to let 'em go. You stop poking at old wounds that don't belong to you." "They belong to me when they involve my boat and my father," she shot back, feeling the rising heat of righteous anger. "And they involve Celia. What happened to the girl at the diner? The one who loved him?" The mention of the name Celia was the final blow. 2 of the captains at the counter abruptly slid off their stools and walked out, their heavy boots thudding a rhythm of silent protest and withdrawal. Finnegan looked devastated, his defenses crumbling not at the thought of Alistair, but at the mention of the girl. Celia, she left, Finnegan finally managed, his voice barely audible, thick with something that sounded like regret. She was heartbroken. Went south. Boston, maybe. Don't look for her, Elena. Don't ask about her. Your father, he was trying to do right by her. But the Lowells have long arms and deeper pockets than you can imagine. He looked her straight in the eye, the ancient wisdom of the docks returning to his gaze. You found this chest for a reason, but you can't fight what's buried, La Brava. It'll swallow you whole. Elena realized the conversation was over. Finnegan wasn't just silent, he was warning her. The community wasn't protecting a lie, they were protecting themselves from a powerful, old-money family, the Lowells, who had the means to enforce their will, perhaps even to bury a tragedy beneath a layer of convenient secrecy. She left the diner, the heavy silence of the dockside now a palpable weight on her shoulders. She had achieved one thing, confirmation. Alistair, the Lowell's son, was the missing man, and Celia, the dockside girl, was the catalyst. Her father was entangled in the middle. The only thing left was the sealed letter in the chest, the one piece of evidence that might speak the unvarnished truth before the local fear could completely shut her out. Elena returned to the quiet of her cabin, the heavy silence of the dockside following her like an unwanted shadow. Old Man Finnegan's trembling voice and the fearful withdrawal of the other captains resonated in her mind. The Lowells have long arms and deeper pockets than you can imagine. She understood now that the secret wasn't just about a lost boat or a missing boy, it was about the crushing power of the Rockland elite over the Port Clyde working class, a conflict as old as the coastline itself. Her father, the kind, silent man in the photograph, hadn't been an accomplice to a crime, he had likely been a silent protector caught in the crossfire between vast wealth and desperate love. Zeus met her at the door, sensing the heightened tension in her posture, offering a low, comforting rumble in his chest. Elena knelt and ran her hand over his dark, thick fur, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. The time for digging through old memories and confronting unwilling witnesses was over, at least for the moment. The final, uncorrupted piece of the 40-year-old puzzle lay waiting, the piece of thick, heavy paper, sealed by the wax stamp bearing Alistair's initialed monogram, A.L. She retrieved the chest from beneath the floorboards. The kerosene lamp provided a focused beam of light on the letter, illuminating the deep crimson of the wax seal. This seal, unlike the rusted padlock, wasn't broken by the sea, it was an intentional final barrier, an act of trust meant to protect the message from water, prying eyes, and, most likely, his powerful father, Robert Lowell. It was the last, sacred promise. With a deep, steadying breath, Elena took a sharp paring knife, the kind used for filleting cod, and carefully slid the tip beneath the edge of the seal. She broke the wax with a soft pop that echoed loudly in the small space, a sound that felt like the snapping of a 40-year chain. The thick paper inside, folded twice, was remarkably preserved, protected by the heavy seal and the cloth shroud. The letter was not a journal entry but a direct, desperate plea, written in a clear, angular hand, signed Alistair. Elena noticed that the ink, unlike the faded sepia in the journal, was dark and fresh, suggesting it was written in the utmost haste, moments before the chest was committed to the water. The paper smelled faintly of cheap pipe tobacco, a smell she vaguely associated with old fishermen's shacks, perhaps her father's shed. The first lines hit her with the force of a confession. To the kind soul who finds this, I entrust you with the only life that matters. This is my last will. I fear what is coming, and I fear my father's wrath more. He would ensure that Celia and our unborn child are wiped from the family history, from their very existence. Celia is carrying my son, Robert, named in a futile, desperate hope for peace. She is terrified, and I have had to make a final stand. The news was exactly as Elena had suspected, a pregnancy. The devastating confirmation of a forbidden child, and the name, Robert, after Alistair's own tyrannical father, twisted the tragedy further. Alistair hadn't just disappeared, he had preemptively protected his legacy from a man who would erase it entirely. Elena's eyes raced down the page, consuming the frantic details. I am leaving the coast on a boat provided by a friend, a true, silent friend who risked everything for us. I am taking the sea glass out into the worst of the nor'easter, making it seem that only I was aboard, a tragic accident that saves Celia's honor. I will transfer to the other vessel before dawn. My friend knows the plan. He will take Celia south, far from Rockland and the Lowells, where she can raise Robert in peace and safety. The name of the man who helps us is Finian. He is a friend to the dock, and a true keeper of promises. This chest is my testimony. Finian. Old Man Finnegan. The piece of information she couldn't extract at the diner, he had carried in his silence for 40 years. Her father, the silent friend in the photograph, had also been involved. They were not Alistair's killers, but his co-conspirators in a grand, desperate escape plan, staging Alistair's disappearance on the ill-fated sea glass to buy Celia and the baby time and safety. The McAvoy boy must have been lost in the true storm, his tragedy used to mask Alistair's fake one. The small community of Port Clyde had collectively protected this truth, facing down the Lowells' long arms, with silence. The final instructions were the core of the letter, the ultimate purpose of the chest. The locket is for my son. The journal is his history. The photographs are his parents' faces. But the most important promise is this: Celia left a small, unique carving, a stylized compass rose, hidden in the pilot house of the Sea Witch. If this chest is ever found, it means the secret is safe. Find my friend Finian. Tell him the compass rose has been found. This code will tell him that the time has come to contact Celia and the adult Robert. My son deserves to know his father loved him fiercely enough to disappear for him. Find them. Tell my son he is not erased. Elena felt the letter tremble in her hands. The news was an adult son named Robert, living somewhere, unaware of his lineage and his father's sacrifice. Her father, Finian, and the whole of Port Clyde had maintained a lie for 4 decades to protect a woman and a child from the rage of the Lowell family. The secret wasn't hers to keep, it was a mission handed down by a ghost. She had to find Finian, give him the code, and finally allow Alistair's son, Robert Lowell, to know his own truth. The sea had not just delivered destruction, it had delivered a destiny of atonement. The letter lay on Elena's worn kitchen table, no longer a piece of fragile paper but a 40-year-old warrant, a command from the grave. Alistair Lowell's urgent script had shifted Elena's entire worldview. Her father was not a silent participant in a tragedy, but a selfless co-conspirator in a grand, desperate rescue. And Finnegan, the fearful old man at the diner, was Finian, the friend who had kept a promise under the chilling threat of the powerful Lowells. Elena had spent the night staring at the ceiling, the pieces of the puzzle fitting together with a painful, yet satisfying, click. Her grief for her father, once mixed with faint, undefined suspicion, was now replaced by profound respect. Before the sun was fully up, painting the sky over Port Clyde in harsh, cold reds and grays, Elena secured the Sea Witch and, with Zeus trotting silently beside her, headed straight back to the dockside diner. She didn't bother with the subtle approach this time. She found Finian sitting in his usual booth, the faint aroma of stale coffee and fear clinging to him. He looked even older, even more burdened, than he had the day before. He flinched visibly when he saw her, his eyes immediately darting to her hands, checking for the photographic evidence. Elena didn't sit down. She stood over him, blocking the weak morning light. It's not about the photograph anymore, Finian, she said, her voice steady and low. It's about a name, and a promise. The compass rose has been found. The effect of the code word was immediate and absolute. It was a physical shock. Finian's entire body seemed to deflate, his shoulders slumping as if a massive, invisible weight had finally been lifted, or perhaps replaced by a new, more terrifying burden. The old man didn't whisper this time, he simply nodded slowly, his eyes filling with 40 years' worth of unshed tears. My name is Finian, he confirmed, his voice a dry rasp that cracked with age and relief. I knew you were coming back. The sea doesn't give up something like that unless it means for the promise to be honored. He gestured weakly to the seat across from him. Sit down, Elena. Sit down, La Brava. Let me tell you about the summer of '83. Finian began his tale, starting with Alistair, the wealthy boy who despised his inheritance and fell completely for the authentic, demanding life of the fisherman. He spoke of Celia, whose beauty was matched only by her fierce pride and deep loyalty to Port Clyde. Their love was an open secret among the dock hands, a dangerous one that simmered right beneath the surface of the town's social fault lines. Robert Lowell, Alistair's father, was a brute force of a man who saw Port Clyde as nothing more than a source of cheap labor and an embarrassment. When he suspected the affair, he started making aggressive, unannounced visits, threatening to use his substantial financial power to crush Celia's family and anyone who stood in Alistair's way. But the news, Finian whispered, leaning in so close Elena could smell the pipe tobacco she'd sensed on the letter, was the turning point. Celia was pregnant. She was terrified of what Robert Lowell would do. He wouldn't just disown Alistair, he would use every lawyer in Boston to take the child and ensure Celia was ruined, left penniless and scorned in a place that already distrusted outsiders. Elena's father, Finian explained, was the true silent hero. He and Finian were lifelong friends, bound by the unwritten code of the sea. Elena's father, recognizing the deep injustice, came up with the plan, a fake death, a staged disappearance, using the nor'easter as the perfect cover. Your father, Finian recounted, his voice catching, had the sea witch. He was the one who sailed out that night, a few miles ahead of the sea glass. Alistair left the chest behind, knowing that if it was ever found, the secret was safe. He boarded your father's boat. Your father then transferred him to a deep-sea trawler headed for Newfoundland, a place where no Lowell would ever look. The true, hidden tragedy was Finian's. He was the one tasked with the second, more dangerous half of the plan, securing Celia's escape. I drove Celia down the coast that same night, away from Port Clyde, away from Maine. We traveled for days, using cash, until she was safely hidden in a small town in rural New York, far from the ocean. I set her up with a new name and a modest amount of money Alistair had managed to save. I promised Alistair I would never look for her, never contact her, unless this chest, this compass rose, was ever found. It was the only way to ensure Robert Lowell couldn't trace them back through me or through your father. For 40 years, Finian had lived with the lie, the silence a heavy coat he couldn't remove. Every time the McAvoy family grieved for their lost son on the sea glass, Finian felt the weight of the elaborate deceit. The community, knowing the general truth of the conflict between the Lowells and the Docks, had chosen collective silence, an act of defiance against old money. They allowed the story of the one, true lost son to mask the planned disappearance of the other. The secret was their shield. The sea witch, she was a part of their escape, Elena murmured, finally understanding her boat's role. She was the last familiar thing Alistair saw, Finian confirmed, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. He knew your father would protect Celia's honor and the boy's future. The boy's name is Robert, after his awful grandfather, a small, sad irony. He's about 40 now. He thinks he's an orphan, raised by a single mother far from the sea. Elena, you have the code. You have the truth. 40 years of silence ends now. You have to find Robert, and you have to give him what his father died, or disappeared, to protect. The meeting ended abruptly, the relief and fear in Finian's eyes a desperate plea. Elena now possessed the full, agonizing truth. The secret wasn't a tragedy, but a 40-year sacrifice. Her mission was no longer a personal quest for information, but an act of redemption for her father, for Finian, and for the ghost of Alistair Lowell. She knew exactly what she had to do next. The confrontation with Finian had shattered the 40-year silence, replacing Elena's confusion with a fierce, redemptive clarity. The chest, the nor'easter, and the relentless persistence of Zeus had all been instruments of destiny, guiding her to this singular mission. Her father, the quiet, stoic fisherman who had taught her the silent wisdom of the tides, was now a figure of profound nobility, a man who risked everything to protect a young mother and her child from the long, grasping reach of the Lowell dynasty. The secret of 1983 was not a source of shame for Port Clyde, but an enduring testament to their solidarity against the power of old money. Elena sat back down at her kitchen table, the contents of the chest spread out before her, the silver locket meant for Robert, the journal detailing his parents' desperate love, and the photographs capturing their last moments together. Finian had given her the history, but the physical task, the act of atonement, was hers alone. She had to find Celia and Robert. Finian, bound by his original vow to Alistair, could not risk contacting them directly, fearing that any recent communication might lead the older, now even more powerful Robert Lowell Sr. back to them. Elena, a new player in an old game, was the clean slate. The challenge was immense. Finian could only tell her the basics. Celia had taken the new name, Claire Mason, and had settled in an isolated, rural community in upstate New York, far from any coastal water that might remind her of Maine. This was decades before the age of internet searches and social media. Elena, a woman of the sea, now had to become a detective of the land. Her first act was a practical one, demanding the same methodical focus she applied to repairing her boat engine. She used the few connections she had, distant cousins who had moved inland, old shipping contacts, to search records from 1983 to 1985 for birth certificates, school enrollments, or property deeds filed under the name Claire Mason in upstate New York. She spent days hunched over her phone and a battered laptop, powered by a sputtering generator, filtering through microfiche records accessed through a small-town library database. Zeus, sensing the shift in her energy from physical labor to mental strain, remained close, his warm weight a comforting reassurance on her feet. The search was slow and disheartening. There were several Claire Masons. Some had moved again, some were too old, some were too young. Just as despair began to creep in, leading her to believe the trail was utterly cold, she found a promising lead, a record of a young woman named Claire Mason, listing her place of origin as non-local, who purchased a small, run-down farm in a secluded valley town near the Adirondacks in late 1983. Crucially, the same name, Claire Mason, appeared as the legal guardian for a newborn son named Robert Mason in 1984. The timing was perfect, and the distance from the coast, both physical and cultural, matched Finian's story. This was Celia and Robert. The thought of facing Celia, a woman who had spent 40 years building a new life, convinced her secret was safe, filled Elena with apprehension. What right did she have to burst through that protective wall? She was about to introduce a 40-year-old ghost and the crushing weight of a powerful lineage into a life of carefully cultivated peace. Yet, Alistair's final plea echoed in her mind: "My son deserves to know his father loved him fiercely enough to disappear for him. Find them. Tell my son he is not erased." It was a moral imperative, an act of justice for a man who made the ultimate sacrifice for love. Elena decided to travel. She couldn't risk revealing the true story over a phone call. She secured the sea witch for the coming winter, a task that normally took weeks but which she completed in days, driven by the urgency of her mission. She packed a small bag, carefully tucking away the journal, the locket, and the photographs. She arranged for a neighbor to watch her house and her traps, but Zeus, sensing a journey, refused to be left behind. His insistence was quiet but absolute. Elena knew she needed him. His presence was not just comfort, it was a link to the life she was leaving behind, and a silent promise of her return. Together, the iron skipper and her Malinois turned their backs on the Atlantic and headed inland, driving south and then west, leaving the familiar scent of salt and pine for the unfamiliar air of the mountains. The drive was long, an exhausting blur of interstate highways and anonymous motel rooms, a world utterly foreign to the secluded rhythm of Port Clyde. As they approached the designated valley town, the landscape shifted from the rolling hills of New England to the stark, towering peaks of the mountains. Elena felt a pang of nostalgia for the vast, open horizon of the sea, yet also a powerful surge of anticipation. She was nearing the end of her father's unfinished story. She located the small farmhouse, a charming, if dilapidated, place set deep in a valley, surrounded by dense forests. Elena parked her beat-up truck a distance away, her heart pounding a heavy tattoo against her ribs. She was about to confront the living consequences of the secret she had pulled from the ocean. She took a deep breath, clutching the small box containing the journal and locket. This wasn't just delivery, it was an act of profound, life-altering empathy. She was there to deliver not just objects, but the truth of a father's fierce love and the atonement for 40 years of silence. With Zeus pacing intently at her side, she walked toward the door, ready to knock and finally utter the name Celia. Elena stood on the weathered porch of the isolated farmhouse, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her heavy boots, a sound alien to the soft rhythm of the Atlantic tides. Zeus, his ears perked and his body instinctively protective, pressed close to her leg. She could hear the distinct sound of life inside, a television murmuring and, faintly, the rhythmic thump-thump of an old washing machine. This was the peace Alastair Lowell had paid for with his disappearance, the quiet life that Port Clyde's silence and her father's bravery had secured. She raised her hand and knocked firmly. The sound felt aggressive, a sudden, jarring intrusion into 4 decades of carefully guarded anonymity. The door opened almost instantly, revealing a woman in her 60s. Her hair was still dark, though threaded with silver, and her eyes, light and expressive, just as Alastair had described in his journal, held an immediate, deep wariness. This was Celia, the dockside girl, now Claire Mason, the protective mother. Celia's eyes flickered from Elena's weathered face, marked by the Maine sun, to the powerful presence of Zeus, and finally to the simple, small wooden box Elena carried. "Can I help you?" Celia asked, her voice even, devoid of the sharp wit Alastair had admired, replaced by the practiced neutrality of someone who long ago learned the importance of blending in. Elena didn't waste time on pleasantries. She knew that any ambiguity would simply prompt Celia to shut the door. "My name is Elena. I'm from Port Clyde, Maine. I own the Sea Witch." Celia's composure broke, a tremor running through her frame. The name of the boat was the second code, the personal link that bypassed 40 years of prepared defenses. Her hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes, wide with sudden, cold realization, began to scan the empty forest, searching for the long arms of the enemy she thought she had outrun. How do you know that name?" "You need to leave. Now." "I can't," Elena insisted gently, holding the box out. "A recent nor'easter brought this to my shore. I was asked to deliver it. I spoke with Finian." Elena then spoke the final, sacred code, confirming the successful completion of the mission's first half. "Finian knows the compass rose has been found. Celia staggered back, clutching the doorframe for support. Tears finally streamed down her face, tears of shock, immense relief, and the crushing weight of memory. "Oh, Dios mío," she whispered, reverting momentarily to a phrase from a past life. "Alistair, the chest. He kept his promise." She ushered Elena and Zeus inside, her secrecy instincts momentarily overridden by 40 years of pent-up sorrow. The living room was warm, filled with the scent of wood smoke and old books. Elena was quickly introduced to Robert Mason, a man in his early 40s, her age, with a quiet strength and his mother's expressive eyes. He was a forest ranger, deeply connected to the mountains, a world away from the ocean that claimed his father. He was confused by the presence of the unexpected guests and his mother's breakdown. Elena placed the chest's contents on the small wooden coffee table. "Robert," Elena said, her voice husky with emotion, "your father didn't abandon you. He made a choice so you and your mother could live free from a terrible threat." She began with the silver locket. "This is for you." Robert opened it, revealing two miniature, water-stained portraits, a fiercely proud Celia, and a boyish, anxious Alistair. Then came the full confession, recounted by Celia herself, punctuated by Elena's details from the journal and Finian's story. Celia explained the toxic control of Robert Lowell Sr., the imminent threat of disinheritance, and the desperate pregnancy. She described Alistair's selfless plan, a staged death to free his family from the Lowell name and wealth, allowing his son to grow up without the chains of expectation and without the risk of being forcibly separated from his mother. Robert listened in stunned silence, a lifetime of assumptions about his missing father crumbling around him. Elena handed Robert the letter. He read the final plea: "My son deserves to know his father loved him fiercely enough to disappear for him. Find them. Tell my son he is not erased." And the dam broke. He wept not for a lost father, but for a man who loved him fiercely enough to choose oblivion. Elena then gave him the journal, the full, passionate record of Alistair's life, his resentment for the Rockland elite, and his profound yearning for authentic life. Robert was not erased, he was, in fact, the entire reason for the elaborate deception. The reunion was not joyous, but cathartic. Elena spent 2 days with them, sharing stories, answering questions about Port Clyde and the Sea Witch. She explained her father's role, securing his legacy as a silent protector. She helped Celia contact Finian, closing the loop for the old man who had honored his pledge for 40 years. When it was time to leave, Robert walked her back to the truck. "You came all this way," he said, looking at the distant mountain peaks, "to deliver a truth that changed everything." He hugged her tightly, an act of kinship forged across decades. "Thank you, Elena, for giving me my father's real story." Elena drove away, Zeus riding shotgun, looking back at the mountains. She felt a lightness she hadn't experienced since before her brother's death. The sea had not just delivered destruction in the nor'easter, it had entrusted her with a sacred purpose, to close a circle of love, sacrifice, and family loyalty. She was no longer just the iron skipper, weighed down by her own grief. She was the keeper of the compass rose, the final messenger in a tale of coastal defiance. The road back to Port Clyde was long, but she drove with the sun on her face, knowing that the sea which was waiting for her, no longer a vessel of work, but a symbol of her family's true, quiet courage. Her life, finally, had a new, profound meaning, and the rhythm of the tides, once a reminder of loss, now promised return.